Atlantic Canada has both the assets and the ambition to be a leader in the global hydrogen economy. But ambition and assets without hydrogen infrastructure and supply chains and a workforce is really just a wish. So that raises the question that's keeping hydrogen developers and investors and policymakers up at night. And the question is, does Atlantic Canada actually have what it takes to turn that ambition into reality? And if we don't, what will it take to get there? The Atlantic Hydrogen Alliance recently commissioned Deloitte to find out. Working alongside Net Zero Atlantic and Energy NL, Deloitte conducted a study to assess Atlantic Canada's hydrogen supply chain capabilities, including what already exists today, what can be strengthened, what's missing, and importantly, what action will be needed to serve both domestic and export hydrogen markets. The study was funded by the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, the Province of Nova Scotia, Opportunities New Brunswick, the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador, and the Government of Prince Edward Island. I'm Derek Estabrook, Executive Director of the Atlantic Hydrogen Alliance, and your host for Atlantic Canada's Hydrogen Future, a podcast about the industry leaders, energy experts, innovators, researchers, and policymakers who are writing the next chapter of our region's energy story. They're the people actually doing the hard work to build a thriving low-carbon hydrogen sector from the ground up. Today, we're talking about the hydrogen infrastructure, supply chains, and workforce that Atlantic Canada is going to have to build to unlock hydrogen's full potential and position our region as a clean energy leader. To discuss the study's key findings and recommendations, I'm joined today by Matt Campbell, an energy transition leader at Deloitte and the project manager for the study. Matt, welcome to the show. So before we dive into the study, can you tell us a bit about your background and some of the work that you do at Deloitte?
Yeah, sure thing. So I lead Deloitte's public sector energy transition work in Atlantic Canada. And I tend to work at the intersection of policy, where that meets infrastructure and market development. So I think this is a really good topic for us to discuss today. Um, and so my work with Deloitte has touched pretty heavily on offshore wind in recent years, on clean fuels like green hydrogen, SAF, both on the production side, but also on the use side, and also regulatory modernization. Um, and my background, I think, before joining Deloitte, just about 10 years ago, comes from government. So I'm a public policy guy, I think, at heart. And so before joining Deloitte, I served as a senior policy analyst with the government of Nova Scotia in the Cabinet Office. And before that, as an aide on Parliament Hill in Ottawa. So I like to think my focus is kind of a public sector perspective, but working really closely with all actors in the ecosystem, producers, developers, midstream, all the way across. So that's a little bit about myself. I grew up in Prince Edward Island and reside in Nova Scotia today.
Okay, well, welcome. So this study was a pretty ambitious undertaking that assessed the entire hydrogen value chain, all the way from production through to end use. It identified opportunities to strengthen Atlantic Canada's hydrogen supply chain. It benchmarked our region against other leading jurisdictions in Canada and also international markets. And it developed recommendations to build out our hydrogen supply chain. Now, that is a lot to try to pack into one study. So could you tell us about how Deloitte approached the work to try to achieve all of those deliverables?
It was a lot. It was a lot. It wasn't just a supply chain report. We covered policy and regulation. We covered government support mechanisms, which, change day to day, month to month. We covered, like you said, a jurisdictional review because kind of in these early markets, it's really interesting to know, okay, what's Australia doing? What's Germany doing? What's the US doing? What are other parts of Canada doing? So we looked pretty far and wide to understand, okay, what's happening in these other parts of the world and jurisdictions where we have a lot in common with. We had to define, okay, what is the hydrogen ecosystem? We had to look at future scenarios. We had to look at, how big this thing might get. We had to look at the different parts of the supply chain and industry, but also communities and in indigenous communities and Mi'kmaq communities in Nova Scotia, and then indigenous communities throughout Atlantic Canada. So it covered a lot of territory, and so when you're looking at on one hand the policy, the other hand the codes and standards, it's a lot of territory to cover. And so what we did, Derek, is we kind of covered it in kind of three big pushes. One was leveraging all of the existing research and work that has been published in recent years, because a lot has been done. Net Zero Atlantic has done quite a bit of work. The AHA, with you, which you've been a large part of, has done quite a bit of work. We've worked closely with Neil Jacobson, who with Roxham has done quite a bit of work in this space, and like I said earlier, quite a bit of literature review was done, hundreds and hundreds of footnotes, and so that was really the first part, just getting a sense of, okay, what is the current state of the hydrogen industry and the green hydrogen industry today and derivatives. The second thing we did after the literature review and jurisdictional scan was to really engage with the supply chain. We worked closely with the four provinces to identify the key players across all the different parts of the supply chain and reach out to them. And we really wanted to understand, okay, if this is about supply chain readiness, the only way to determine that is to engage and speak with and hear from the organizations that are part of the supply chain. Um, and in some ways, you know, we don't have a big supply chain in hydrogen today because we aren't producing uh, much green hydrogen. We are producing hydrogen in the Maritimes, but we do have a pretty robust midstream. We do have lots of transport companies. We do have companies all across the spectrum. We've got producers that are advancing projects across across the Atlantic provinces. So there are lots of organizations today that are part of the supply chain today and could be part of this tomorrow's supply chain, and we really wanted to engage both of them.
I
So
thought it
we
was
yeah.
interesting when we reached out to these companies and organizations that some of them actually hadn't self-identified that they were even part of the hydrogen supply chain. Like they were involved in adjacent industries like, oil and gas or energy services or engineering. So we identified them as part of the supply chain, but they really hadn't even thought much about it. So I think that was just an example of how undeveloped the supply chain is currently, when some of the companies that will need to be part of it haven't really consciously identified the opportunity for them.
Yeah, I completely agree. The other thing I noticed is there was a lot of interest and a lot of excitement about the opportunity without knowing exactly what the opportunity would be, without knowing exactly the size of the opportunity and when it might happen. So I think there was a genuine curiosity, a genuine interest, and a flexibility. Grounded in reality and grounded in real markets, that this could be a large opportunity. It could be a significant opportunity. We don't quite know how it's going to roll out or when it's going to roll out, but we want to be part of the opportunity. So there was a lot of interest from lots of parties, I'd say, and lots of parts of the supply chain that wanted to participate and advance this. There was just a lot more questions than answers. So I completely agree with you. One of the things we did to try and mitigate that, Derek, was really the third thing we did in the study, which was bring people together. So we went and held three regional workshops in Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Labrador, and in New Brunswick, and we engaged a number of others in Prince Edward Island by phone. And I thought that was a really great opportunity to bring all parts of the supply chain together, from producers to and upstream to midstream transportation companies, all the way down to potential end users. And that was, I think, for me, the highlight of the project: bringing people together in one room to understand, okay, what are the barriers, what needs to be done now, soon, later. And I think that really drove a lot of insights for the project, and led to a few aha moments.
Okay. So we often hear about Atlantic Canada's natural advantages when it comes to the hydrogen sector. And so tell us, based on Deloitte's assessment, what are some of the assets and advantages that Atlantic Canada can leverage to help position us for success in the hydrogen sector?
This, as someone who lives in Atlantic Canada, we sometimes take some of this for granted, I think, Derek. Like, I hear some of these advantages again and again that are deployed in different industries, and you kind of, become numb or immune to them. But really, when you start comparing this part of the country to other countries around the world, we've got, incredible, stable democracy, which is, something not to be taken for granted, right? We're seeing today, and it all depends on when you're listening to this podcast, but some really challenging times in the Middle East, and real chaos on some of the energy markets. So. I think that's one thing that we do have and we take for granted, and something that was not probably all that evident or top of mind when we were writing the report, but is top of mind now. Uh, but on the physical infrastructure side and natural assets and competitive advantages, we've got multiple deep water ports, that and that can handle kind of liquid bulk handling. We've got strategic proximity to European markets, which is really critical for getting this to market and participating in the global fuels market. We have exceptional wind resources, which has, we've had a pretty strong onshore wind industry for decades, but the interest in onshore and offshore has really expanded in recent years, to put it lightly. But wind resources, and in tandem, a lot of crown land and water. These are kind of key inputs to generating electricity in terms of crown or private land, and water, which is obviously a key input in electrolysis. Not every jurisdiction has a lot of those things, and we've got a ton of it. We've got great existing infrastructure, some of which will need to be upgraded. We've got, highways, rail. We're connected to continental U.S. That'll be helpful, bringing in equipment, bringing in labor, bringing in all sorts of supplies as we kind of build up these facilities. And I'd say lastly, and maybe most importantly, we've got an incredible skilled workforce here, building on, hundreds of years of marine experience here, but building on the oil and gas sector, predominantly in Newfoundland, Labrador, but to a large extent, we've had a lot of activity here in Nova Scotia, and then also in New Brunswick continues to be a really significant player today in refining and supplying households and businesses with fuel. So we've got a lot to be proud of. We've got all the right ingredients, and so I think we're really well positioned when the markets are ready.
I agree. And you mentioned stability, and I think this is an increasingly important advantage in these really uncertain times. Mark Carney highlighted the importance of stability in a speech at the World Economic Forum a couple of months ago, where he really highlighted Canada's position as a stable, reliable partner in a world that's anything but stable.
Yeah.
And we know that, Europe and other parts of the world are really looking for reliable, stable, and trustworthy energy trading partners. And, jurisdictions like Atlantic Canada really kind of fit that need well. So let's move on and talk about the supplier survey that you mentioned. During the course of the study, you surveyed over 80 organizations across Atlantic Canada's hydrogen supply chain. And you asked them about their interests and capabilities and readiness to develop Atlantic Canada's hydrogen supply chain. So, what did you learn about how prepared these organizations are today? Maybe tell us a little bit about what's stopping them from becoming more active in our hydrogen sector.
Yeah, that was a really interesting part of the study. I think once you kind of get in and engage with suppliers, that's where the real insights are. Upstream and enabling organizations. So we're talking about engineering firms, fabricators, utilities, renewables developers, producers. Um, these are the most prepared companies to take advantage of the opportunity, and they feel, we asked about supply chain readiness. They feel ready, which I think makes a lot of sense. They're in this world day to day. They are engaging in these projects. They're thinking about next steps. They're putting forward plans and moving toward FID and a lot of these things, and they're doing detailed design. So these organizations should maybe not come as a surprise as organizations that are feel ready. Where the region is a bit less developed is maybe the midstream parts of the value chain, things like storage of hydrogen, pipelines, port infrastructure, large scale logistics. I think that part of the supply chain is kind of waiting for production to start before we get to moving it and reaching markets to some extent. So we did find in that part of the supply chain there was maybe less readiness, more of a wait and see kind of attitude. And on the plus side, they're moving things every day. They're storing things every day, maybe different fuels. We think maybe the gap from where they are today to where they need to be is not a huge gap, but just in terms of readiness and kind of where their head is at, there's some territory to cover, but we remain optimistic about it. Downstream, thinking toward end users like transportation, industry, that's a very early stage. We saw, and you would have seen Derek in the Strait of Canso, part of Nova Scotia, looking at how can we use clean fuels in our economy and doing a pretty thorough study to see, okay, what are the opportunities, what makes sense economically, where's the technology today in terms of leveraging clean fuels. They've got production pitched right next door, so they want to see how they can become some of the first customers of clean fuels. And so I think that is really terrific. But there's still a lot of work to do on looking at how we can use clean fuels domestically. At the beginning of this project, we understood it was largely an export play for the region, looking to export green hydrogen and ammonia to markets in Europe. I think toward the end of the study, it seems to be in a similar place, and maybe even more questions around timeframes. So the world has changed in the course of starting this study and completing it. Uh, I think end use is really an important nut that has to be cracked, because that is connected to production, right? There have to be customers for there to be producers. So I think there's some readiness that needs to happen on the end use as well. So the big barriers we heard, high hydrogen production costs. It is more expensive to produce green hydrogen than the other forms of hydrogen, and is certainly more expensive to produce and move once you take into account all of the economic activity. Hydrogen than things like natural gas and others incumbent fuels. So the lack of infrastructure being another barrier. Uncertain demand. I think we talked about that extensively today and for the past 6 months, and the need for kind of clearer policy and funding programs. There's a real need for us to kind of shore up demand and be a bit more aggressive in that space. So, lastly, maybe I would say like one thing that stood out to me. I don't know about you, Derek, when you were reading this part of the report, but it was the kind of regional differences at how the workshops were very, very different in Newfoundland than they were in New Brunswick. And, the feeling, the appetite, the readiness is different based on which province you're in. So I think that's something that folks would really enjoy reading in the report, the kind of how it is different in each of the different um, provinces. But I'd maybe end by saying, the capability exists. The organizations are largely there. Maybe we're not producing electrolyzers in Atlantic Canada on day one, but uh, you know, as the market develops, I think a large part of the supply chain exists here and can leverage past experience and some of those assets that we talked about to really stand up an effective industry. It's probably one step at a time, and this doesn't kind of build overnight.
Yeah, I did find it really interesting participating in the 3 workshops over 4 days. So we really, got to experience them, one day after another, and just how different the feeling was in each of the workshops, which maybe shouldn't have surprised us, but it did surprise me. And it's not that anyone was better or worse. They were just different in terms of where their current priorities were and how much focus they were putting on the hydrogen sector. That
and
was
and and and,
interesting.
and the focus on different parts of the supply chain as well. Like in New Brunswick,
Exactly.
really heavy emphasis on midstream, but in Newfoundland, maybe a focus on production, as was there in Nova Scotia as well. So very different flavors in each kind of gathering.
Right. And we heard in Newfoundland, the focus was very much on production for export. Where in Nova Scotia, we certainly heard that, but we also saw a lot more interest in the domestic uses for hydrogen within the province.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the parts of the study that I found really interesting was the analysis that Deloitte did to determine the scale and the types of equipment and the workforce that would be needed to support a single large hydrogen electrolysis production facility. So a facility that would be producing hydrogen for export. So can you tell us about um, the work that you did and sort of what you determined would be needed in terms of the infrastructure and equipment and workforce to support a single facility of that size?
Yeah, absolutely. This was maybe for me one of the big surprising moments from our time working together, and we'd done a little bit of work as Deloitte, quantifying the economic impact of uh, green hydrogen facilities in Nova Scotia. And so it was great to leverage that work and look at, okay, what are the production forecasts in Atlantic Canada. So there's this great resource that we have called Canada Energy Futures. They put out forecasts through 2050 around a number of different fuels, and so they do have green hydrogen forecasts, production forecasts, 3 different scenarios. There's other scenarios that we looked at from other organizations. This one seemed to be the most robust and the most defendable. They recently just actually refreshed their forecasts as well, and it was good to see they're still in the same sort of ballpark. So essentially, what we did, Derek, was we kind of took one representative facility, one kind of like standard facility, and we looked at one that would be maybe about, some of these projects have kind of phase one, phase two. We looked at the phase two, the kind of the larger um, uh, uh, production site, and somewhere in the territory of kind of 1.3 gigawatt size electrolyzer. Um, and that might be producing in a year, in a representative year, maybe 185,000 tons of green hydrogen. And then when you pull in the nitrogen and you make green ammonia for export, maybe that's about a million, kind of just over a million tons of ammonia. So we're talking about large scale production facilities using a lot of electricity, a lot of electrolyzers, and a lot of clean fuels for export. So to build facilities of this size, we looked at construction, of course, where a lot of the economic opportunity is, but also operations. And so to operate a facility like this, you're looking at like 200 people, 200 jobs, FTEs, whatever you call it. And so these are kind of net new jobs in the community, and relatively competitive wages. So for each of these facilities, and maybe there's one facility that's constructed, we forecast as many as 19. Maybe it's somewhere in the middle by 2050. It's hard to take out the crystal ball and predict the future, but even just for one facility, it can take about 2,500 workers to build the facility. So there's quite a bit of economic opportunity, quite a bit of like GDP produced just in constructing a facility. And when you look at multiple facilities kind of being built over a given time frame, so we looked maybe up until 2035, which is not very far away. Each of these might take 4 years to build, kind of end to end, these kind of larger size facilities. So you start stacking those up across the region, it adds up to significant amount of jobs. If we were to see the very high end of the scenario, it could be up to 20,000 jobs focused on building exclusively hydrogen production plants. We're not saying it's going to be exactly that many. It'll all depend on how many of these facilities are built out. But
And
even one facility, yeah.
one of the challenges we identified is that it would be one thing to build a facility in Halifax or St. John, New Brunswick, or St. John's, Newfoundland, and have to assemble a workforce of 2,500 people and house them for a few years while that construction's happening. It's a very different challenge to assemble that workforce in a more remote community. And the reality is all of these large hydrogen export facilities are proposed to be built in less urban areas where just the availability of housing isn't what it would be in an urban center. And then related to that, we also identified the challenge that these projects aren't likely to be built in isolation of the rest of the economy. We're also proposing to build large offshore wind projects and mining operations, and so there'll be competition for that workforce as well. So it just sort of highlights the importance of government sort of planning how these large infrastructure projects are developed over the next 10 or 15 or 20 years.
Yeah, I remember us talking about this a few months ago, and when we first start exploring new industries and significant build out of new industries, there's a lot of excitement, right? We see the positive, and as we get closer and closer to construction, well, we start to see the trade-offs. And so I think you put a nail on it when you described housing as an example. And I think this is something that we've certainly seen as a challenge in Labrador, as Newfoundland Labrador is looked at expanding hydro in some really significant mega projects. So not a new challenge, not insurmountable, but a significant one. So it is interesting the kind of human dynamics, the psychology that kind of comes with every opportunity. There are challenges that come. So we see this as a significant opportunity, whether it's one facility, whether it's many more facilities, and it will take careful planning because you're right. There are hospitals, there are other mega projects, there's offshore wind, but the timing is a hard thing to get right. So I think constant planning, constant kind of workforce readiness. I'd say one highlight, Derek, is the strength of the community colleges. That really shone to me. They are very quick on training workforce. We've got a great workforce to begin with, but in terms of getting new people into the workforce, they were able to turn around a program in months. They were able to recruit in a year and a bit, and they were able to get people into the workforce in just a couple of years. So they're kind of watching really carefully, but they're quite good at getting us the people we need and the skill sets we need when we need them. The good part is we've got a little bit of time.
Right. Okay. So the study concluded that we're making progress. Well, that's encouraging, but it also identified some pretty critical gaps that could threaten that progress, especially with the large export projects. What did this study conclude are some of these big bottlenecks that are standing in the way of projects getting to a final investment decision?
I could probably spend 40 minutes just on this one. So I encourage folks to take a look at the report. It is a good read. But stepping back, the biggest bottlenecks I think fall into two or three categories. The first one, we're no stranger to it, is demand uncertainty. Strong interest still internationally. We've seen progress recently with auctions moving forward in Europe and Germany around covering the kind of cost gap in green hydrogen. But there are still very few long-term bankable offtake agreements that we've seen. There was some positive news just recently with some investments with one of the producers. But without these bankable long-term offtake agreements, it's really difficult for these projects to reach financial investment decision. So we need to shore up demand. We need to shore up, customers for this product. Otherwise, it's going to be a really difficult time. The second category of kind of gaps would be under infrastructure. So, especially in the midstream, we talked about that earlier, storage, pipelines, port facilities that need upgrading. Upstream production is relatively well understood. Producers are, I'd say, quite mature, and developers in Atlantic Canada have really great engineering firms, really great partners. But moving hydrogen and ammonia at scale requires infrastructure that largely doesn't exist yet. A lot of these producers are looking at building their own jetties and ports as well. So there's a lot to be built, and some of these roads will need upgrading as well. The third is really around policy and regulatory coordination. So things like permitting, things like safety codes, getting consistent regulations from province to province to province, ideally kind of Canada-wide or at least regional-wide. If we do develop the industry differently, significantly differently from a regulatory perspective in different provinces, it adds complexity. It adds, uh, difficulty for developers that may be present in multiple jurisdictions as well. And we do have a workforce that is relatively mobile, that moves kind of up and down. People do move across provinces, so I think it will be important to get the regulation right and harmonized. It's not the top concern. I'd say, demand uncertainty is many times more the issue. But I think that's something that's within our control. We don't have full control over global markets for clean fuels. We do have control over regulations and getting things organized and consistent. So we thought it was important to include that. Ultimately, this is a big export opportunity, which makes it very reliant on export markets. That creates risk. So um, I think overall, it's not just one bottleneck. It's that production, infrastructure, demand, and policy all have to come together to kind of get this industry moving. We're seeing lots of progress, like you said, but there's still some coordination that we can all do to make this smoother and be ready when the opportunity uh, presents itself. And so we are hoping to see shovels in the ground in the next little while, and we're looking forward to that first facility coming online.
Great. Well, at the end of all that work, based on everything that Deloitte learned, you made several recommendations, and they were laid out in kind of four priority themes to help us move from the ambition we have to the execution that we're going to need to realize the opportunity around the hydrogen sector. So, based on what you learned, where do you think we should be focusing?
So that's a great question. We kind of stepped back at the end of it and thought, okay, where should we put our limited energy? Because we've got four provinces here. We've got three lead organizations, the Atlantic Hydrogen Alliance, Net Zero Atlantic, Energy NL, all influential, capable, resource constrained organizations. And so how do we organize as a region, which is never easy on any issue, let alone standing up a brand new industry? And there's competitive tensions around investment attraction that never go away as well. So how do we do that? And where do we focus specifically over the next kind of 12 to 18 to like 36 months? We didn't want to look, 10, 20 years into the future. You can have another report, another podcast guest do that. But first, we thought, okay, we need to build demand and supply together. So that means developing domestic uses for hydrogen, while also working on export opportunities, so that projects have more certainty. So advancing things like lighthouse projects. We've talked before about potential opportunities in the defense sector. Really getting a few, you know, demand anchors, I think, is important, whether they are here or overseas or both. But to the extent we can kind of shore up demand, that's critical. Second is, okay, this is not going to be 20 facilities overnight producing tens of millions of tons of clean fuels tomorrow or next year or even a couple of years from now. So we have to grow organically as well, right? We need these demonstration projects to show that hydrogen can work in real applications like transportation, like industry, energy systems. We've seen some challenges. I'll be honest on some of the domestic projects. Some of them have been awarded funding and then found it really difficult to get those projects off the ground. So timing's a big factor, but we do have to find some wins here to keep the momentum and to start small and not leave it purely on customers overseas. Third, growing local suppliers we thought was really important, so that Atlantic Canadian companies can maximize their participation in the construction of these facilities, in supplying equipment, in the operations, and not just like hosting passively the projects, but actually capturing the economic value, because that's what these communities are really interested in. They don't just want a new fire truck and like uh, tick box. They want quality jobs. They want opportunities for local suppliers. They want to fully participate. So that's why I think there has been a lot of like positive feelings from communities expressed. So there hasn't been major opposition to these projects like we maybe see in other parts of the country or other types of projects. Fourth, really integrating hydrogen into infrastructure planning. I think this became really clear to us toward the end, and when we think about system costs, right? It's the engineering is not the problem here, Derek. Like it's not engineering, it's economics, right? So the costs have to make sense. They have to make sense for the customer, and so we have to be smart around the infrastructure we're deploying. Um, maybe wind west and offshore wind will be really helpful for this, right? And in we can invest in infrastructure that's supporting multiple industries, right? And it's not just supporting one project or another project, but it's supporting entire uh, multiple industries. So I think getting the infrastructure right, building it in a way that reduces overall costs will make a lot of sense, because ratepayers and customers can only handle so much cost. So I think we'll have to be smarter on that. Um, we also talk about hydrogen hubs. We think there's some opportunities there, where production and storage and transportation and end users are kind of co-located in the same area that can reduce overall infrastructure costs. So kind of grouping these things geographically, and we have a whole section on the report that looks at potential hydrogen hubs in the region and identifies different assets and players. But yeah, I think those are the big things, Derek. Securing that early demand through maybe procurement programs or pilot projects, uh, public transportation. There's a lot of opportunity to help us move from strategy to real projects, real infrastructure planning, and pulling that all together, and being close to the market at the same time. So it's a delicate dance, but we think there's a lot of things that can be done today that are no regret moves that would position the region well for the future. So we remain optimistic. We're long on Atlantic Canada here at Deloitte, and we're long on decarbonization and economic growth, and this does both of them.
Well, this has been a really interesting discussion. Let's wrap up by looking ahead. The report's very well written. It's very detailed. But if you were going up in an elevator with someone from the provincial government or an industry leader who hadn't read this study, like what would you want them to take away from it?
Yeah, it's tough to boil down. It's hundreds of pages. I think we've done a good job at to putting together an executive summary for some of the listeners that are a bit time constrained and have an infinite pile of reports that they have been meaning to read. I think if I could boil it down, I'd say Atlantic Canada does have the assets and capabilities to participate in the global hydrogen economy. But success is not guaranteed, right? We've got the ingredients, but we've got lots of work to do. Um, our biggest advantage will be working together regionally rather than individual projects, individual provinces going off and developing this industry independently. So it's really encouraging to see all four provinces come together on this project, and that's you don't see that every day. So we've been really privileged to be part of that. Infrastructure needs to be planned, like we said, at the regional level to be economic. It's not just an energy transition story, it's an industrial and economic development opportunity for the region. So I look at the premiers that we have in office today. They're looking for generational opportunities. They're looking for legacy building opportunities. They're looking for real economic growth, and this can be one of them, absolutely. But to realize the opportunity, we'll have to close the infrastructure gaps. We'll have to develop the workforce and training programs. We'll have to support local suppliers, to build domestic demand. We'll have to do this all together. And while maintaining public trust and working with First Nations and Mi'kmaq communities and Indigenous communities throughout the region, not just as participants, but as equity players in these projects as well. So, overall, I think the window of opportunity is open, but the next few years will be critical in determining whether Atlantic Canada becomes a global hydrogen producer and a global exporter, or just an observer. So we're very encouraged by the work to date, and we think there's an incredible opportunity for the region and for the country. This is important for Canada. And like you said, we are a dependable, reliable trading partner, and we're building more links every day. So we're pretty positive on the future. We don't have crystal balls, but we're pretty keen to see the next steps.
Well, that's a good way to conclude this episode. Matt, I really appreciate your time today to talk about this really important topic. It's maybe not the most exciting part of the hydrogen sector, but might be the most important. And if you've enjoyed this conversation, please follow Atlantic Canada's Hydrogen Future wherever you get your podcasts. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. And you can connect with us on LinkedIn, or you can learn more about our work on our website at atlantichydrogen.ca. Thanks for listening.